On a July day in 1795, on a road outside Delft near Manchester, a crowd of women stopped a bread cart. They took the loaves out of it. The carter, a man named Richard Broom, almost certainly thought he was being robbed. In any ordinary account of the period, that is exactly what this is, a highway robbery by a mob. Except that isn't what happened next. The women sold the bread to the people standing around at 2p a pound, and then they counted up the takings and put every penny of it back into Richard Broom's hands. Read that again, because everything else in this video hangs on it. They did not steal the bread. They set the price of it, sold it at that price, and handed the money to the man they had taken it from. That was not a one-off. In 1795 and 1796, there were something like 74 separate disturbances across Britain over the price of food, and a great many of them followed exactly this pattern. Historians call them price-setting riots. Crowds, very often crowds of women, which is why the Hammonds later called it the revolt of the housewives, would stop a wagon, occupy a market, or walk into a mill, take the flour or the grain, sell it at what everybody agreed was the customary fair rate, and return the money. E.P. Thompson, who wrote the classic study of this, called it the moral economy. His argument was that these people were not behaving irrationally, and they were not simply hungry, though they were. They were enforcing a set of rules that everybody in an English market town had understood for centuries, that in a time of dearth, the local supply comes first, that you don't ship grain out of a starving district for a better price elsewhere, that you don't buy up a crop in the field before it reaches market. Those rules had been law. There were statutes against forestalling, engrossing, and regrading. There was the assize of bread. Magistrates had enforced customary prices to keep the peace. And in the last decades of the 18th century, that entire structure was being dismantled, deliberately, in favor of the free operation of the market. So the women on that road outside Delft were not attacking the law. In their own minds, they were the last people still applying it. The state did not agree. That same year, at Warwick, a woman named Margaret Bolker was hanged for her part in an attack on a steam flour mill in Birmingham. 2 men were shot dead by troops in the same disorder. In Sussex, 2 soldiers of the Oxfordshire militia, Edward Cook and Samuel Parrish, were executed by a firing squad, their offense being that they had led hungry soldiers who seized bread and flour from a mill and sold it to local people at reduced prices. Their defense was that the food was being hoarded or sent abroad, while their own families went without. Shot for selling bread too cheaply. And this is not a peculiarly British story. It is the mechanism. In Paris, in the spring of 1789, a 4-pound loaf could swallow up to 88% of a working family's daily income, and the Bastille fell on the precise day the price of bread returned to its peak for the century. In Petrograd, in 1917, the revolution began with women queuing at bakeries. In Berlin that same year, a cut to the bread ration put 300,000 people out of the munitions factories within days. Not ideology, not armies, the price of a loaf. Now look at your kitchen. There's probably a bag of sliced bread in it. It costs roughly the same as a bus fare. If it goes stale, you'll throw it out without a second's thought. And you are in enormous company. In the United Kingdom alone, something like 20 million slices of bread are estimated to go in the bin every single day. How did we get here? How did the thing people were hanged over become the cheapest object in the supermarket? And what did we stop seeing while we moved the bag from the shelf to the trolley? But this story does not begin on an English road or in a bakery. It begins 14,000 years earlier in a black basalt desert in the northeast of what is now Jordan, around a hearth, among people who do not yet know what a field is. To understand why anyone later died over bread, you first have to understand what bread actually is.
As it has since the beginning.
A grain is the seed of a grass. It is hard, close to indigestible, and built by nature specifically so that you cannot use it. The starch comes packed in dense granules that your enzymes barely reach. Eat a handful of raw wheat and you get stomach cramps and almost no calories. Now do 3 things to it. Grind it and the coat breaks open. Add water and the starch takes it up. Heat it and the granules burst. The starch turns to gel and your body can finally get at it. Milling, water, fire. 3 operations that turn an inedible seed into the most efficient source of calories available to a human being. Bread is the first processed food in history, and arguably the single most important technology we have ever invented. Not the wheel, not the plough, but a method for unpacking grass. There is a second part, and it explains why the world settled on wheat. Wheat flour contains 2 proteins, glutenin and gliadin. Separately, they mean nothing, but add water and start working the dough, and they link into a 3-dimensional network that is elastic and extensible at once. That network holds gas. So when yeast begins eating sugars and breathing out carbon dioxide, the bubbles do not escape. They stay inside and they push the dough up. That's it. No other cereal on the planet does this properly. Rye manages it halfway. Barley, oats, millet, maize, rice, not at all.
Contrast. Dense rye and airy wheat.
Which is why bread, in the European sense, is always a story about wheat, and why every other grain in this video is a story about compromise. And then there is the third thing, the least visible and by far the most political. Grain can be counted. It ripens all at once on a known date. It grows above ground in plain view. It can be divided, weighed, poured into a sack, and stored for years without spoiling. A root crop cannot do that. You can leave potatoes in the ground and dig them up after the tax man is gone. Grain can't hide. Grain stands in the field like a set of accounts. Not one early state anywhere in the world grew up on pulses or root crops. Every one of them grew on cereals. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica. Not because grain tastes better, because grain can be taxed. So this is not a story about food. It is the story of how humanity accepted authority in exchange for a guarantee of bread, and of how many times it withdrew that consent afterwards. Let's start with the crumbs. Between 2012 and 2015, archaeologists from Copenhagen, Cambridge, and University College London excavated a site in the Black Desert of Jordan known as Shubayqa Odin. Natufians lived there, hunter-gatherers who, in exactly those centuries, were beginning to settle in one place. In the middle of a round structure built of flat basalt slabs were 2 hearths, one constructed on top of the other. The last one was never cleaned out, and everything left in it was sealed under 1/2 meter of deposit. In 26D, the analysis was published in the journal PNAS. Of 49 charred fragments, 24 were bread. Not porridge, not burnt grain, bread. Under an electron microscope, you can see the porous matrix characteristic of a dough, and the size of the voids and the thickness of the pieces point to a flat, unleavened loaf. Age: 14,400 years. Agriculture will not appear in that region for at least another 4,000. That inverts the order all of us were taught. First, humans domesticated cereals, we were told, and then, with flour in hand, they invented bread. The find says the opposite. First, people learned to bake, from wild einkorn, wild barley, oats, and ground clubrush tubers, and only afterwards, possibly for exactly that reason, did they start to sow. Flour from wild grain cost a monstrous amount of labor. Wild ears shatter, the seeds are small, the husks are tough. A single flatbread meant gathering, threshing, winnowing, and grinding on a stone quern, which is why the researchers say something very specific. This bread was probably not everyday food. It was a luxury, something you served to guests in order to raise your own standing. Stop on that for a second. The first thing a human being did with bread was not to fill their stomach. It was to show off. And perhaps that is precisely why they later picked up a hoe. What happened next was a mistake, botanical, accidental, microscopic, and decisive for everything. Wild grasses have a mechanism they cannot survive without, a brittle rachis, the stem that holds the seeds to the ear. Ripe means shattered. The grain falls to the ground and the species continues. For the plant, this is compulsory. For a human, it is a catastrophe. Half your harvest is on the soil before you arrive with a sickle. Occasionally, a mutation produces a plant whose rachis does not break. In nature, that is a death sentence. That grain falls nowhere and germinates nowhere. But put a person with a sickle beside it, and the logic reverses. Those are precisely the ears that end up in the basket, precisely the ones carried back to camp, precisely the seeds that spill by the dwelling and come up next spring. Nobody bred wheat deliberately. People simply gathered for decades whatever had not fallen off, and in the foothills of southeastern Anatolia, wild einkorn turned, around 10,000 years before our era, into a plant that can no longer reproduce without human hands. Which raises an honest question. Who domesticated whom? Before farming, humans ate dozens of plant species, hunted, and, judging by the skeletons, were taller and healthier. Afterwards, they narrowed their diet to 2 or 3 cereals, shrank, acquired tooth decay, wrecked their knees kneeling at the quern, and picked up the diseases that only exist where large numbers of people live close together. In exchange, there were vastly more of them. In 10,000 years, wheat spread from one hillside to over 220 million hectares, more than any other cultivated plant on Earth. From the grass's point of view, this was the deal of the millennium. It acquired the most obedient servant in history. He plows its soil, waters it, defends it from other species, and kills its competition. In return, it lets him survive. From the human point of view, that depends how you count. Then came a civilization that built absolutely everything on bread, including the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, bread was not food, it was a unit of account. Wages were paid in grain and in loaves. Taxes were reckoned in grain. Temples had their own granaries, and a pharaoh's power was measured quite literally in how many silos he could fill after the Nile flood. Wooden models of bakeries and breweries were placed in tombs so the dead would not go without. Egyptians knew dozens of kinds of bread: conical, flat, with honey, with dates, with milk. It was there, almost certainly by accident, that sourdough was discovered. A forgotten emmer dough caught wild yeast from the air, rose, and somebody was brave enough to bake it. Flour, wild yeast, and patience. That technology is around 5,000 years old and works today in exactly the same way. It had an ugly side. Milling was done on stone, so sand and stone chips inevitably got into the flour. Studies of mummies show appalling dental wear. By their 40s, the chewing surfaces were ground down to the pulp. People wore their own jaws away eating bread. But the most astonishing thing is neither the recipes nor the teeth. It is a single document. Year 29 of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1157 BC. The village of Deir el-Medina, home to the craftsmen who cut and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the labor aristocracy of their day. They were paid in rations, grain from which bread and beer were made. The ration did not arrive. The workmen walked out past the wall, sat down by a mortuary temple, and refused to work. It is recorded that they shouted that they were hungry and that 18 days of the month had already gone by. Officials brought promises, then bread. The strike broke out again. It is the first documented strike in human history, and it was about bread. Remember that detail, because it explains everything that follows. 3,000 years later, in Paris, in Petrograd, and on a road outside Manchester, people will come out with exactly the same demand in almost exactly the same words. After that, bread became politics, and it was the Greeks and Romans who made it so. 5th century BC Athens could not feed itself. Attica is stone and olives. There's not enough wheat for everyone. So grain had to be shipped in, from the Black Sea, from Egypt, from Sicily. And around that fact, the Athenians built a body of law that feels startlingly modern. An Athenian was forbidden to carry grain anywhere except Athens, and forbidden to lend money on a cargo that was not bound for Athens. The penalty was death. There was also a dedicated board of officials whose job was to watch the price of bread and the weight of the loaf in the marketplace. The democracy that invented the jury and the theater imposed capital punishment for a grain ship taking the wrong course, because a severed sea route meant hunger within weeks. Rome went further and turned bread into an instrument of rule. In BC, Gaius Gracchus carried a law under which the state sold grain to citizens at a fixed, reduced price. BC, Clodius made the distribution free. Under Augustus, some 200,000 people were entitled to it. Not beggars, but citizens for whom this had become a right. The grain came from Egypt and North Africa, with its own fleet, its own port at Ostia, and officials who answered with their lives for delivery. A late convoy from Alexandria meant a riot in the capital, and around the start of the 2nd century AD, the satirist Juvenal produced the line everyone still quotes: "The Roman people, who once handed out commands and legions, now longs for just 2 things, bread and circuses." Note the order. Bread comes first. And what an ordinary bakery looked like, we know with a precision no text can give, because in AD 79, Vesuvius buried Pompeii. In a town of some 12,000 people, archaeologists have found more than 30 bakeries, with hourglass-shaped stone mills turned by donkeys or slaves, and domed ovens,
all but indistinguishable from a wood-fired oven today. And in one of them, the so-called Bakery of Modestus, 19th century excavations found 81 loaves, carbonized but whole.
They were sitting in the oven exactly as they had been loaded on the last morning. Each one round, scored into 8 segments so it could be torn apart by hand, and stamped in the middle, bakers signed their bread. 2,000 years ago, a man fired an oven, put the bread in, turned away, and never came back. The bread did. That same loaf, divided into 8, is sold in Naples today. And before we go on, stop on a few words, because English carries this history inside it more openly than almost any other language. The Old English word for a loaf was hlaf. From it comes the modern word loaf. And, because the technology traveled with the word, the Slavic word for bread, chleb, is a borrowing from the same Germanic root. Half a continent still calls its bread by a Germanic name. Now take the word lord. It is a worn-down form of hlafwerd, hlaf, loaf, and werd, warden. The lord is the loaf ward, the man who guards the bread. And lady comes from hlafdiga, where the second element is related to kneading, the one who makes the loaf. The two words at the top of English society are, underneath, a job description in a bakery. There is more. The Latin for bread is panis, which is why a companion is literally the person you share bread with, cum panis. In English, the earner of a household's money is the breadwinner. Slang for money itself has been, at various times, bread and dough. And the old harvest feast on the 1st of August was lamas, from hlafmassa, loaf mass. An entire day in the church calendar named after a loaf of bread, baked from the first grain of the harvest and taken to the altar. Put it all together, the Lord guards the bread, the lady kneads it, your companion is the one you break it with, your breadwinner brings it home, and the harvest festival was named after it. No other food is buried that deep in the language, not salt, not meat, not wine. Which brings us to the moment the English state decided that bread was too important to leave to bakers. In 1266, Henry III confirmed a document known as the Assize of Bread and Ale. It is one of the earliest laws anywhere in Europe regulating the price of an everyday consumer good, and in one form or another, it would last more than 600 years. The logic was elegant. The price was left alone. People were used to handing over a farthing or a penny. What changed was the weight. If grain got dearer, the loaf for that same coin got smaller, according to a table written into the law itself. Assize clerks worked out the weight of a farthing loaf from the current price of a quarter of wheat, and that weight was then binding on every baker in the town. Out of this grew an entire inspection regime. Officials went round the bakehouses with scales. Selling underweight was not a commercial dispute. It was an offense against the community. Bakers were fined, their bread confiscated and given to the poor or the local hospital, and repeat offenders were put in the pillory or dragged through the streets on a hurdle, with the offending loaf hung round the neck so the neighbors could see who had been cheating them. This is also, by the most popular account, where the baker's dozen comes from. Bakers began throwing in a 13th loaf with every 12 so that they could never be caught short of weight. Historians argue about whether the custom really began that way, but the mechanism is exactly right. The 13th loaf was an insurance policy against the pillory. And notice what kind of society this describes. Bread was not a product in a market. It was a regulated public utility with a legal specification, an inspectorate, and criminal penalties. The assize was finally abolished in London in 1815 and across the rest of the country in 1836, which is to say, at precisely the moment our story starts to accelerate. Hold that thought. It matters more than almost anything else here. Meanwhile, the same bread was doing something else to society. It was sorting it. White wheaten bread required the best grain and repeated sifting through fine cloth. Sifting threw away the bran and the germ, up to a quarter of the weight of the grain. Being able to afford white bread meant being able to afford to throw a quarter of your wheat away. Below that came maslin, a mixed wheat and rye loaf. Below that, rye and barley bread, and what was called horse bread. In bad years, oats, peas, beans, and in the worst, acorns and bark. Bread was an identity document, presented 3 times a day. From the color of your slice, anyone could name your station. Now hold on to that division. Pale wheat at the top, dark rye at the bottom. Because at around the same time, rye started killing people. Rye is attacked more readily than other cereals by a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, Ergot.
In a cold, wet season, instead of a grain, a hard black horn grows in the ear, packed with alkaloids. Some of them constrict blood vessels brutally. Others act on the brain. This is the raw material from which LSD would be synthesized in the 20th century. Flour made from that grain looks perfectly normal. Dark powder inside dark powder is invisible. What followed was called Holy Fire, and later St. Anthony's Fire. In one form, the vessels close down, blood stops reaching the extremities, and a person feels their hands and feet burning from the inside, although they are cold. Then dry gangrene sets in, and fingers and feet blacken and separate from the body, without blood and without a wound. In the other form come convulsions, the sensation of something crawling under the skin, hallucinations and visions of hell, which no witness of the time could call anything other than possession. The first securely recorded epidemic hit Aquitaine in some 20,000 dead. Decades later it returned, with estimates of 40,000. Whole districts were emptied in a season, and nobody understood why. People had eaten what they always ate, bread. Around 1095, the Antonine order was founded, and it built a network of hospitals across Europe numbered in the hundreds. There the sick were given wheat bread from monastery stores, made from clean grain, and that was the whole secret. Take ergot out of the diet and the symptoms retreat on their own. The monks believed they were healing with relics. In fact, they were healing with a change of flour. The link between rye and the disease was established by the French physician Thuillier only in 1670. For more than 7 centuries, Europe died of its own bread without knowing why. And in 1976, the journal Science published Linda Caporel's hypothesis that convulsive ergotism might also lie behind the Salem trials of 1692. It was contested immediately, and most historians today weight the social explanations far more heavily. But the fact that the argument is even possible tells you something. 20 people were executed at Salem, and serious researchers have spent half a century asking whether the real defendant was the bread. Ergot was a natural disaster. What came next was a manufactured one, and Britain produced the most inventive version of it in Europe. By the 18th century, city dwellers no longer baked at home. They bought daily, and they bought without looking. And what they wanted, above everything, was white. So white was what they were sold. Alum, a potassium aluminium salt, whitened gray dough and, crucially, let a baker hide inferior flour inside a loaf that still looked expensive. Chalk went in. Ground plaster went in. Bone ash went in. In 1757, An anonymous pamphlet appeared under a title that did most of the work by itself: Poison Detected, alleging, among other things, that the bones being ground into London's bread included bones taken from charnel houses. Whether that particular claim was true has been argued about ever since. What is not in doubt is the reaction. Parliament passed the Making of Bread Act, of which set out to punish anyone adulterating meal, flour, or bread. It is one of the first food safety statutes in the modern sense, and it exists because the public had become convinced they were being fed the dead. Then in 1820, a German-born chemist working in London, Friedrich Accum, published A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons. On the title page, he put a quotation from the Book of Kings: "There is death in the pot," wrapped around a design of a spider's web with a skull in it. It was a sensation. It ruined him socially, and it named names. In the 1850s, the physician Arthur Hill Hassall took the next step. Working for a sanitary commission at the Lancet, he put hundreds of samples under a microscope, published the results with the vendors identified, and made the case undeniable. The Adulteration Acts followed, and 10,006 ate packed. Take the shape of that. It took roughly a century and a half from "everyone knows the bread is doctored" to "it is effectively illegal and enforced." And in the middle of it, Parliament tried the opposite experiment, and it lasted 8 weeks. In 1800, in the middle of a second consecutive terrible harvest, the government passed what is formally the Making of Bread Act, and what everybody called the Brown Bread Act. It banned millers from producing fine flour and bakers from making bread from it. The reasoning was straightforward. Coarser flour extracts more bread from the same wheat, and the country was short. The country reacted with fury. At Horsham in Sussex, a group of women went to Gosden Windmill and turned on the miller for having served them brown flour. They seized the bolting cloth he was using to dress the meal, according to the terms of the new act, and cut it into 1,000 pieces, promising to do the same to any similar equipment he ever used again. According to the newspaper report, the leader of the party afterwards treated her associates to a guinea's worth of drink at the Crabtree public house. The act was repealed less than 2 months after it passed. It even acquired a second nickname, the Poison Act. Sit with that for a moment, because you will meet the same argument twice more in this video. A government looked at the numbers, worked out that wholemeal flour would feed more people from the same harvest, made it compulsory, and was beaten by the fact that people wanted white bread and regarded brown as an insult. The nutrition was on the government's side. It lost anyway. And in that same year of scarcity, 1795, something else was invented that would outlast every one of these measures. In May of that year, magistrates for the county of Berkshire met at the Pelican Inn in Speenhamland near Newbury to work out what to do about laborers who were in work and still could not eat. What they produced was a scale. Poor relief would be paid to top up wages, and the amount would be calculated from 2 variables: the number of people in the family and the current price of a gallon loaf of bread. Read that again, too. A welfare system denominated in bread. Not indexed to prices in general, not to a basket of goods, to the loaf directly. When bread went up, relief went up. When it fell, relief fell. The Speenhamland System spread across much of southern England, and it has been argued about ever since. Its critics, and there were many, all the way to the Poor Law Report of 1030-30 that abolished it, said it was a subsidy to bad employers, allowing farmers to pay below subsistence, knowing the parish would make up the difference.
Its defenders pointed out that it kept people alive through a generation of war, enclosure, and dearth. You can have that argument in modern terms today, using modern words, about in-work benefits. It was first had in an English coaching inn, and the unit of account was a loaf. But the real fight over English bread was still coming, and it lasted 30 years. In 1007, with Napoleon defeated, Parliament passed the Importation Act, the Corn Laws. In the plainest terms, foreign grain could not be sold in Britain until the domestic price rose above a set threshold. The stated purpose was to protect British agriculture after the wartime boom. The actual effect was to keep the price of bread high and to transfer money from everyone who bought food to the people who owned land. And who sat in Parliament? People who owned land. The bill was so unpopular that troops were stationed around the Houses of Parliament while it passed, and the London houses of several MPs were attacked by crowds. For a generation, the Corn Laws were simply a fact of British life. Then, in 1838, a group of manufacturers and campaigners founded the Anti-Corn Law League in Manchester, with Richard Cobden and John Bright at the front of it. The League became one of the first genuinely modern pressure campaigns anywhere. Penny pamphlets by the million, a subscription list, paid lecturers touring the country, newspapers, and a systematic effort to register sympathetic voters constituency by constituency. Their argument came in two parts, and both are worth hearing. The economic one. If a working man spends everything he has on dear bread, he buys nothing else. So there is no demand for manufactures, so the country stays poor. Cheap bread means a customer. The moral one was sharper. A law that deliberately makes food more expensive so that landlords can collect higher rents is not a policy. It is a tax on hunger levied by the people who profit from it. The landed interest had answers, that national self-sufficiency in food was a security question, that opening the ports would ruin domestic farming and depopulate the countryside, that manufacturers wanted cheap bread, mainly so they could pay lower wages, which was not an unreasonable suspicion. Those arguments never fully went away, and versions of them are still being made about agricultural protection today. What broke the deadlock was not an argument. It was the potato blight. And the blight arrived in Ireland, and the crop that fed the majority of the population failed. Robert Peel, the Conservative Prime Minister, a man who had entered politics on the other side of this question, concluded that he could not keep the ports closed against cheap grain while people starved. In 1846, he carried repeal with opposition votes against most of his own party. It destroyed him. His party split, he was out of office within months, and the Conservatives spent a generation in the wilderness. He was right about the principle, and it did not save Ireland. Because here is the part that ought to be said plainly. Ireland's famine of 1845 to 1852 killed around 1 million people and drove roughly 1 million more to emigrate. And throughout those years, food was leaving the country. Grain, butter, and livestock were exported from Irish ports under armed guard, while the people who had grown them died. Historians still argue about the exact tonnages and about how much difference an embargo would have made. The potato calories lost were enormous, and no plausible retention of grain would have covered all of them. But the essential fact is not in dispute. This was not an empty country. It was a country whose people had no money and no legal claim on the food around them. That is what a modern famine almost always is, not an absence of food, an absence of entitlement to it. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the same equation had already produced the most famous political explosion in European history, and it is worth putting beside the English story because the difference in outcome is the whole point. On 13 July 1788, a hailstorm smashed the standing grain across northern France, followed by one of the coldest winters in living memory. By February 1789, the price of a 4-pound loaf in Paris had gone from 8 or 9 sous to 14.5. Wages did not move.
A family ate around 8 pounds of bread a day. A laborer earned 20 to 30 sous. By the spring, as much as 78% of a Parisian family's income was going on bread. On 14 July, the price returned to its peak, and the Bastille fell, and the crowd went there for grain as well as gunpowder. In October, the market women of Paris walked 20 kilometers in the rain to Versailles, demanding bread, and brought the royal family back to the capital, calling them the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. On 21 October, a baker named Denis Francois was dragged from his shop for supposedly hiding loaves, was found innocent at a hearing, and was hanged from a lamp bracket anyway. The next day, the National Assembly passed martial law. 4 years later, the Revolution tried the same experiment Britain would try in 1800.
On November 15, 1793, the convention decreed the bread of equality. There would no longer be one bread for the rich and another for the poor, and every baker was to make a single loaf, 3 parts wheat to 1 part rye, on pain of imprisonment. France banned white bread by statute. Britain banned it and repealed it in 8 weeks. Both governments discovered the same thing. You can legislate the price of bread, you can legislate its weight, and you can even legislate its color, but you are legislating against a habit older than the state itself. And then, within a single generation, the industry did what no law had managed. It made white bread cheap enough that nobody had to argue about it. In the 1870s, milling moved from stone to steel rollers. The technique was perfected in Hungary. The scale came from the mills of Minneapolis. Rollers allowed the grain to be separated into fractions, the bran on one side, the germ on another, the clean, starchy endosperm in the middle. The result was snow-white flour, cheap, within reach of anyone. What had signified wealth for 1,000 years became, in 50, the ordinary condition of a factory worker. Except the germ was gone, and in the germ sit the fats, the B vitamins, the vitamin E. It was not removed out of malice. Those very fats are what turn rancid, and flour without the germ keeps for years instead of weeks. The industry chose shelf life. The bill arrived as deficiency disease, and it ended in the mandatory fortification of flour. In the United States from 1941, and in Britain during the war, when calcium was added to national flour on the recommendation of the nutritionists McCants and Widdowson. Humanity first learned to take everything valuable out of the grain, and then pass laws requiring some of it to be put back. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in the whole British part of this story. By 1937, Britain was importing something like 70% of its cereals, most of it wheat, carried across the North Atlantic from Canada. Those convoys were being sunk. In March 37 alone, U-boats sank hundreds of merchant ships heading for Britain. The Ministry of Food had a simple mathematical problem. White flour uses roughly 70% of the grain. Whole meal uses nearly all of it. Shifting the whole country to higher extraction flour meant more bread from the same number of ships. So in 3017, commercially baked white bread was banned. In its place came the national loaf, wholemeal, high extraction, fortified with calcium and vitamins, produced to a small number of legally prescribed recipes, and it was the only bread you could legally buy. Bakers were forbidden to slice or wrap it. They were required to sell it a day old on the grounds that stale bread cuts thinner and wastes less. The nation hated it. It was gray. It was heavy. It was frequently described as mushy, and people blamed it for their digestion. Surveys found roughly 1 person in 7 preferred it to white bread. It picked up the nickname Hitler's secret weapon. When Eleanor Roosevelt visited Buckingham Palace in 1942, she was served exactly the same wartime bread as everyone else. And here's the fact that stops people in their tracks. Bread was never rationed in Britain during the Second World War. Churchill regarded rationing the loaf as a blow to civilian morale that the country should not have to take. Bread and potatoes were deliberately left free as fillers so that nobody starved. Bread was rationed after the war was won. On 21 iulia 1946, more than a year after victory in Europe, the Labour government introduced rationing of bread, flour, and flour confectionery. It lasted until 24 iulia 1948. The reasons were real. A wrecked national economy, a world grain shortage, the need to feed the population of the British occupation zone in Germany, and a dollar position so weak that the country could not simply buy its way out. There was also, as the historian Anna Zwinegar-Barjalowska has documented, a diplomatic calculation. Britain needed American help, and looking needy was part of getting it, even though a 4-year wheat contract had been signed with Canada that same July. But try explaining that to a woman in a queue in 1946. She had gone through the Blitz without a bread ration and was now, in peacetime, being handed coupons for a loaf. The introduction of bread rationing was the single most resented act of the whole austerity period. Housewives organized petitions. The Daily Mail ran campaigns. Average body weight went down. The national loaf itself survived until 1956. The moment it was withdrawn, the country went back to white bread almost overnight, even though the national loaf years had left the British population, by several measures, healthier than at any previous point in its history. Which tells you something uncomfortable about all of this. Twice in a century and a half, a British government worked out that darker bread was better for the nation, made it compulsory, and was defeated by the simple fact that people would rather have the white loaf. And in 1967, in a village in Hertfordshire, an industry finally worked out how to give them one for almost nothing. The problem was this: British wheat is soft, low in protein. Strong wheat had to be bought abroad with foreign currency the country did not have. And traditional bulk fermentation takes anywhere from 3 hours to overnight, which is time, wages, and floor space. The British Baking Industries Research Association, set up with government backing and the involvement of the big baking firms, found a solution that is brilliant as engineering and questionable in almost every other respect. If the gluten network develops during fermentation, then it can also be developed by force. The dough would be worked in high-speed mixers, taking a precisely measured amount of energy in a few minutes. The specification is about 11 watt-hours per kilogram of dough, delivered in under 5. To make that work, you add more yeast, more water, hard fat for structure, ascorbic acid, and oxidizing agents. Bulk fermentation as a stage effectively disappears. The result? From sack of flour to sliced, wrapped loaf on the shelf in about 3.5 hours instead of overnight. A soft, high, airy loaf that will not go stale for a week. Made from cheap British wheat. It was developed by Bill Collins, George Elton, and Norman Chamberlain and named the Chorleywood bread process. By the 1970s, most British bread was made this way. The figure usually quoted today is around 80%, and the method is spread to dozens of countries. Now the part that matters to you personally. You will never see those words on the packet. The processing enzymes that replace the older chemistry are, in many jurisdictions, not classed as ingredients at all, but as processing aids. And processing aids do not go on the label. What makes your loaf go stale is declared. What keeps it soft often is not. The same goes for color. A dark loaf is not necessarily wholemeal. It can be white flour with malt, caramel, or roasted barley. Brown does not mean whole. It means brown. That is the honest summary of the last 200 years.
The state fought for a century to guarantee the weight of your loaf, then walked away from the market entirely. And the industry filled the space with a loaf that is cheap, uniform, soft, and made by a method nobody is required to tell you about. While Britain was industrializing its bread, someone on the other side of the world was solving a completely different problem: how to make sure there was enough of it. His name was Norman Borlaug, an agronomist from Iowa. In the 1940s, he went to Mexico to work on a wheat crop being destroyed by stem rust. He bred rust-resistant varieties, but the decisive discovery was something else. Well-fertilized wheat grows a heavy ear and falls over under its own weight, snapping the stem, so the harvest rots on the ground. The plant had to be shorter. Crossing his lines with the Japanese dwarf wheat, he produced short varieties that put their energy into grain rather than straw. Mexico, which had been importing wheat, was feeding itself by the mid-1950s. In 1965, on the edge of a catastrophic famine, those seeds went by the wagon load to India and Pakistan. Yields multiplied. In 1970, Borlaug was given the Nobel Prize, not for science, but for peace. Estimates of the lives saved run as high as 1 billion. The other half of the story is that dwarf wheat only works with fertilizer and water, which means natural gas for nitrogen, pumps and irrigation, falling water tables, salinated soils, and monoculture across millions of hectares. And a monoculture is defenseless against a single new disease. The world was fed, but on credit, and the repayments are still running. So here's what the ledger looks like now. Wheat supplies humanity with around 20% of all the calories it eats and roughly the same share of its protein. It occupies more than 220 million hectares, more land than any other plant on Earth. World production has passed 800 million tons a year. No other foodstuff is traded in greater quantity, and the entire system hangs on very few hands. The largest exporter in the world today is Russia. The Black Sea region, together with Ukraine, has in some years supplied around 1/4 of global wheat trade. The largest importer is Egypt, where wheat provides more than 1/3 of the population's calories, and bread has been subsidized since the middle of the last century. In Egyptian Arabic, the word for bread is aish. The same word means life. When the government tried to cut the subsidy in 1970, the country exploded within 2 days, and the decision was reversed immediately.
Britain sits in this picture as a comfortable importer with a strange relationship to its own staple. Around 11 million loaves are sold here every day. The overwhelming majority are bought in supermarkets, and the number of craft bakeries has been falling for decades. And the waste figure is the one that ought to sting. Something on the order of 20 million slices of bread thrown away every day in British households. A product our great-grandparents queued for with coupons in peacetime within living memory. Then there are two threats that get very little airtime. The first is biological. In the late 1990s, a new race of stem rust, the very disease Borlaug fought, was identified in Uganda, and when it was recognized, the overwhelming majority of the world's wheat varieties had no resistance to it. The spores travel on the wind, across borders and oceans. Borlaug's work had to be done again, in a hurry. The second is climate. Studies pooling field trials and models estimate that every degree of global warming cuts world wheat yields by roughly 6%, and wheat is especially vulnerable to heat during grain fill, where a few abnormal days in the wrong week can cost a region its harvest. And there is one last reversal worth seeing whole. For 1,000 years, white bread meant wealth, because it meant you could afford to throw a quarter of the grain away. Industry made white flour cheap, and the signal stopped meaning anything. Then the pendulum swung back. Today, a wholemeal sourdough loaf from a craft baker, made from precisely the flour the poor were stuck with, costs 2 or 3 times the price of a wrapped white sliced loaf from a supermarket. Peasant bread has become the bread of people with money. The lord's bread is the cheapest item on the shelf. The social signal did not disappear. It simply reversed, and we didn't even notice. Nor has power over bread disappeared. It has only changed shape. First it was the assize table and the pillory for a baker light on weight. Then it was a tariff written by landlords and a relief scale calculated from the price of a gallon loaf. Then it was a coupon book in peacetime after a won war. Now it is a handful of export ports, a small number of corporations controlling the world grain trade, and a manufacturing process that the law does not require anyone to print on the bag. We have not stopped depending on whoever holds the bread. We have only stopped seeing them, because between us and them lie a few thousand kilometers and a plastic bag priced like a bus fare. And that is the truly astonishing thing about all of this. Everything human beings have ever killed for had something exceptional about it. Gold is rare. Spices came from the end of the world. Oil delivers power. This is grass, a weed off a stony hillside in Anatolia that cannot be eaten raw and has to be ground, wetted, and heated before it is food at all. And that was enough for the first states to grow up around it, because it could be counted and taken. Enough for Athens to impose the death penalty on a ship steering the wrong course. Enough for Rome to feed 200,000 people and call it a right. Enough for Europe to die of its own rye for 7 centuries. Enough for a woman to be hanged at Warwick and 2 soldiers to be shot in Sussex for selling bread below the market price. Enough to split a governing party and end a prime minister's career. It turns out that a thing does not have to be precious to bring down governments. It only has to be daily and unavoidable. People will tolerate almost any injustice, right up to the day it puts itself between them and breakfast. Think about that the next time you open the bag of sliced bread. Think about the fact that the first strike in recorded human history broke out over a late bread ration 3,000 years ago beside the wall of a village in the Egyptian desert. Think about the fact that Lord once meant the man who guards the loaf. Lady meant the one who needs it.
And companion means the person you break it with, and that all three words are older than any wage. Think about the women on that road outside Delft who took the bread, set a fair price, sold it, and handed back the money, and about the fact that some of the people who did that were hanged for it. And the next time you throw a stale slice in the bin, hold your hand there for 1 second. You are holding 14,000 years of somebody else's labor, a dozen revolutions, and the one thing on this planet that has put people in the street more often than freedom has. If you made it this far, subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this coming. And tell me in the comments which part surprised you most. The bread baked 4,000 years before the first sown field? The crowds who robbed a cart and then handed back the takings? Or the fact that Britain rationed bread only after it had won the war? I genuinely want to know which one landed for you.